This is Brie Gorrell, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate and undergraduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is between myself, Ashley Newby, and John Drabinski, host of the Black Studies Podcast, reflecting on the 100th episode and what the series has taught us about the meaning of Black study and Black studies. We discuss the unique contributions made by the field of Black studies, how critical framings across the series impact pedagogy and research, and what sorts of hopes, aspirations, and expectations we have for the future of the podcast. Good morning, this is Brie Gorrell here with the Black Studies Podcast, and today I am honored to be hosting the 100th episode alongside its founders, Drs. John Drabinski and Ashley Newby. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to have you. This is actually also your welcome on to part of the host of the podcast, so you join us at 100.
Yes.
So welcome to you as well.
Thank you. How are you both today?
Doing pretty well. How are you?
Doing all right. I can't complain. Very excited and grateful to be here. I guess we can jump right in. I wanted to ask you both, what does the 100th episode mean for you?
So one, it's kind of mind-blowing that it's 100 episodes. It has truly been like a whirlwind, but I think that it speaks to the willingness of so many people to want to talk about this field that we love and are engaged in and have dedicated ourselves to, but also the range of specialties and interests and projects and activism that happens within Black studies. Like, I think having that much range and 100 episodes, but there's still like so many more people we could talk to. So much more can be explored, right? And I think it really is humbling and exciting to consider all of the opportunities and possibilities in Black studies itself.
Yeah, I mean, the whirlwind is a perfect word for it. I think for me, when I was thinking about the number 100, just because it's fun to see 3 digits pop up, it's this iconic number that way. I was actually just struck by how I didn't actually think we were ever going to get 100 people to say yes. Just be totally honest. I was like, maybe Ashley has more friends than me, but I'm going to run out of friends real quick. And but to your point, it's like people's eagerness, willingness, and generosity, people reaching out saying, hey, I've been listening, I want to be on it. People responding, excitedly to contribute. And also just the way 100 marks, obviously like a kind of iconic number, but it's also like there's so many more people in the queue. There's so many more people to email. And so what I didn't think is that we would ever get to 100, but I definitely didn't think that we would get to 100 and it would be like, I can already see like 100 more easily coming. Yeah.
That's incredible. 100 is no small feat. That is grand. And the fact that there are so many more people that you are all in dialogue with and that are all interested in sharing space and talking about Black studies is really beautiful. I'm curious to know if there have been any things that have come up in your conversations that have, stuck with you or caught your attention, or if there's anything that keeps coming up or things that have even challenged you, troubled you, or have left you unresolved in any way.
So there's so much unexpected for me. You never know what people are going to have to say. You never know what characterizations people are going to give about Black studies. And I really love that. I think a little bit I was expecting a more uniform kind of discourse about what Black studies is. And I've been so happy that it hasn't been, partly because I just think the series is more interesting for all these really, really different perspectives and ways of characterizing, or often I've kind of come to talk about it as like a portrait, like these different portraits that people are drawing. And what stuck with me is, I've always had reservations, not criticism, but a little bit of reservation around multi and interdisciplinary. But at the same time, I was like, what is a word? What is a phrase? What is something that can capture that collection of approaches that help solve Black studies problems?
Mm.
And so for me, the talking about that, the sheer diversity, both in terms of the way people approach these questions, whether it's through art or curatorial work or political education or literature and so on, is amazing. And then the way people try to think about it as undisciplined, anti-disciplinary, and so forth. But I think the thing that's stuck with me in terms of challenging me, because I really love just these different, I just leave every podcast sort of thinking about like, how does my portrait sort of get changed by the conversation? But there's one particular series of moments in a podcast, actually this day that we're recording it is going to go live with Abdul Kalimat, where he said, one of the things that we really struggle with in Black studies and that Black studies wanted, but we haven't gotten there, is standardization. And on the one hand, I'm like really resistant to the idea of standardization as a sort of compulsion and also as a sort of ideological position that I have. But he's also not wrong that standardization is a challenge. Like we should think about like what stabilizes our field and how can we have a foundation to the field that allows all these differences to live in the same space. And like I feel like unresolved on that. So that's the troubled by or unresolved. And, I like the idea of standardization and I fear the idea of standardization because I know what that means in every other field, right? It means one generation's vision dominates everything. And with that comes class politics, national politics, gender politics, sexuality, normativity, and so forth. And so I've wrestled with that. And every episode I'm kind of listening for like, how does this help me navigate this really murky space?
I would agree with that. I think that the question of standardization and all of the implications that flow from it is definitely something that's very interesting, and is something that is tied to conceptualizations of Black studies as a whole, right? Like field or discipline or some third space that's like multi, interdisciplinary, right? So that is interesting to me. I think that in general, just the centrality of questions and issues has been so interesting to me, in how people take a question that they have or a topic that needs to be explored and bring in all these different methods. And what it means to take methods from these more traditional bounded disciplines and modify them or break them apart in order to use them for the purposes of Black studies. And the intentionality behind that process has been super interesting. And like I've learned so much about how like historians take archival methods and shatter the ways in which the boundaries that have been placed upon them. And even thinking about literature and things like qualitative interviews, like all of the ways in which those things have to be modified if we're thinking about them from a Black studies perspective. And it's not enough to do research that engages with Black communities. You have to center them. And in centering them, that shifts everything. And I think that has been a really important reminder. And it's been really helpful to learn how so many people have done that in different ways.
I mean, hearing you talk too, I'm reminded of, I think where what you're talking about really sort of crystallized for me was the conversation that you had with Vince Brown where, it was back and forth, but there was just this moment where he's like, look, what I do is I say, this is something that's of concern to Black people. And I figure out how do I solve the problem or how do I answer the question? Whatever I can use, I use. And there was just that moment, like it, you both had been talking about it, but there was just that moment where he goes, I'll just take whatever. And it's just, Vince's delivery on it, I think, was really good, but it was just like that moment of like, I'll just take whatever, and if you don't like the way I gather these things, then that's your problem. The real question is, have I addressed the issue? And that's where that question of like interdisciplinary, I kind of felt like that issue fell apart for me. I was like, why do I care about multidisciplinary? This is what tool helps like solve the problem.
Yeah.
Or what collection of them. Yeah. Kind of repeating what you said, but it was that particular conversation like really, really got to me, it really captured something for me.
Yeah, I thought that conversation and then the conversation with Dr. Makalani focusing like on the questions, the centrality of the questions themselves, and then an episode that is forthcoming in the future with Dr. Marissa Parham, like the way that she conceptualized multidisciplinary versus interdisciplinary and the problems with locking yourself into one of those approaches and the limitations that can bring in and of itself, right? And so I do think that like going back to the conversation with Michigan State's African American and African Studies department where Dr. Ruth Nicole Brown said like anti-disciplinary. I think that that's a really good conceptualization of what has to happen if we are taking whatever is necessary in order to address issues that are impacting Black populations.
And it just, if I can drop a citation, because, as one of the few people in Black studies working on the Francophone Caribbean, Glissant has this really interesting comment. It's in a preface to Patrick Chamoisseau's novel, The Chronicle of the Seven Sorrows. And he says that the Caribbean intellectual is an odd jobs worker. He's just someone who arrives in the downtown or at the port and can do all the jobs. And, when, hearing all these kinds of things, I'm like, yes, that odd jobs worker. But what makes him a productive odd job worker is that his skills are expansive. And so what for me is that name for that skills are expansive, because it's a metaphor or it's an image, right? And I think that comes back to, this come up in many podcasts, came up in our department meeting yesterday, right? Black ways of knowing. And I think that's one of these unnamed but absolutely foundation pieces of what standardization would look like. It's like, well, Black ways of knowing and the way different methodologies can help those ways of knowing speak different languages or across multiple languages.
Yeah, and the taking, which also lends itself to thinking about, in academic spaces in particular, like what counts as knowledge, and and for the vast majority of people that we've spoken to, like what counts as tenurable knowledge or knowledge that is going to be acknowledged and recognized in a way that adds to job security, to be real, right? And what that means for how we integrate or centralize Black ways of knowing in institutions that don't always consider those to be valid forms of knowledge. Because it also speaks to, like, in the conversation with Dr. Achebe, it takes time to do Black studies. Like, you can't just go interview somebody once and then write about it, right? There is a responsibility and accountability that you have to have with the community in Black studies that takes more time, that takes more effort, and that doesn't follow a linear path in the same way that, like, the manual on qualitative research is going to tell you. It's not ABC. It's a back and forth that is necessary in order to actually engage with Black communities and centralize Black ways of knowing.
Yeah, that podcast episode was like some sort of like meta master class or whatever we want to call it in what it means to do human connected research, right? I mean, she was just like, no, I had to sit for a long time. It's both about trust, it's about comfort, it's about the slow secretion of knowledge. It's not announced in one conversation, as you say, the totality of this. No, that was pretty amazing.
Thank you both so much. I appreciate that in doing the podcast and in reflection, something that has really stuck out to you both is the ways in which scholars, or even artists across these different spaces attend to Black life, and really thinking about, like you were saying, like the tools and the methods that they use to really attend to Black life in ethical, communal, collective ways. Thank
And
you
I
both
think
so
that
much.
ethical part is so
Mhm.
key, right? It's like, how do we do that ethically? And the
Yeah.
Chebe's podcast, again, that the ethics of that were in that articulation of our own research, I was like, okay, this is what we all need to be holding ourselves to, that level of an ethical standard. I love that.
This far in, has the podcast confirmed things about the field for you? Have you had any realizations or just any, I guess, nuance after having these conversations with scholars and artists across different fields?
I think for me, like, it has been very affirming, um, in that a lot of times because so my degree is in Black Studies, but this is being at Maryland is the first time that I've worked in a department of Black Studies, um, and so being in other spaces, sometimes I felt a little like all over the place. But it has been really affirming to do the podcast and talk to so many people about the fact that, like, nah, you're just Black studies, which doesn't necessarily fit neatly within all these other, like, there's not a neat box that you check off these 5 things and, like, this is what you do as a Black studies scholar, right? And so the way that a lot of the research that I've done in the past and a lot of the teaching and the pedagogy that I've done in the past has been very much like, I'm gonna take this from education and this from rec comp and this from history. It makes perfect sense in Black studies, and I don't know that I didn't feel like I made sense until I started being able to talk to other people who were doing similar things or had that realization and were able to concretely talk about it. So it has been super, super helpful for not feeling like I just don't know what I'm doing, but that so it's helped a lot with that.
Yeah. A lot of the, the affirmative or confirming part of it for me has been, my own version of what you were talking about, Ashley, is having taught in philosophy departments for, 8 or 9 years and working on Caribbean and African American thought and some Latin American thought, and having to argue with people in a philosophy department that these were philosophical traditions, and the moral and political and spiritual exhaustion that came from that. I mean, that's just a really demoralizing argument to have. It's like arguing that a group of people are humans, basically, because philosophy, there's nothing post-human about philosophy. It's the most human thing we do, try to make sense of the meaning of our lives. And hearing people, I think, talk about how Black studies has liberated their tongue, that they speak and write differently and also research differently. It just, I don't know. I always feel like a deep sigh, like, okay, yes, it's like a relief to be in this space. I think some of the nuances for me are just the nuances around the word community, because I know that that's such a central part of talking about Black studies, and it ought to be. I do think it has a different obligation. I think women and gender studies is similar. It just has a different obligation to a certain liberation project. And I think that until we started this podcast, had, unbeknownst to me, a very limited idea of what that word community could mean. And there have been a number of podcasts where people have just said, look, it's this sense of the everydayness of life that we study and that we give our language to, or modify our language to take account of, however people go about it. But that sense of community, that our wisdom resources, our knowledge resources, our community resources. So it's not just are you giving your time to the community on a kind of, we're over here, they're over their way, but instead also this, because I mean, that's real. And there's significance to all of that, but that sense of like that the mixtape that's on a table on the corner, right, is a source of knowledge. That a quilt is a source of knowledge. I did a podcast yesterday, which will come out after this one, with Kelly Morgan, talking about how she got into Black art and Black art history through just thinking about the porcelain on her grandmother's shelves and what it meant to have this porcelain and what that said about, and then she was able to expand this whole story. And it was just one of these examples of like, that's also what community means, as like where we look to our knowledge sources. And that's a nuance. It's not like I didn't already do that, but I had not said that to myself. And when I heard people say it and I said it to myself, I feel like I understand what I do better, but it's also made me start to talk a little bit differently about the things that I talk about. If I want to talk about a song in an essay, I have a richer sense of even just how to approach talking about a song, a lyric, a sound, right? A speech pattern or tick or vernacular, because that idea of community got so expanded for me across the podcast. It's been like, it's a nuance that actually is kind of like, like when you get your eyes checked at the doctor and they click the wheel and all of a sudden like the thing far away becomes clear. I kind of had that experience.
Thank you both. I appreciate your answers. I'm happy that the conversations have been affirming, and then also it's really exciting to hear like just how it also expands your understanding of knowledge resources and how knowledge can be gleaned from so many different spaces, places, and things, and how central that is to Black studies and Black study itself. So thank you both. My next question is, how do you see the podcast itself helping to bring Black studies, these conversations, beyond academic circles?
I mean, I think that one of the things I hope for the next 100 episodes is that we expand, who's on the podcast with artists and activists. I think getting started, we go to what's most familiar, our friends, right? Our colleagues, people we imagine might want to be on. But when we've had episodes, like you had the one with Ose Moore, had two people from the abolition school in Philadelphia. These are these moments where I hope that it spreads to these other ideas of where Black study is happening, but also where, like, say, we've had a couple of curators on the podcast, and when those curators hear each other, how their own practices, get enlivened, deepened, expanded, or even just affirmed and energized. And then I think about like that sort of community effect, right? It's not necessarily that the people in the gallery space, are listening to the podcast, but that gallery space is somehow impacted, even in just small ways, by the podcast.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, having more conversations with people who are not like traditional academics or have an academic line in somebody's program or department, I think will definitely enrich the conversations, because like you were just saying about community, like the Black studies community is not at all limited to the academy, and arguably the most important part of it is not in the academy, right? And so there are a lot of us who are in these spaces and do research and publish this information, but the actual work is happening outside of these walls in many, many ways that being able to capture is going to be integral, right? We think back to the people who we cite as like founders of the field before the institutionalization. They were out doing the work in different spaces, out of the ivory tower. And increasingly in this moment, that's going to be necessary anyway, right? Like in order for Black studies to sustain, even if the name Black studies, right, is removed from the institution of higher education, it's going to continue in the communities, and having that be central moving forward is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I also think, just to sort of speak your part part of the project, Brie, into this podcast. I mean, that's why I think like the part of what you're going to be doing is talking to leadership at Black student unions across the country. And that's a whole different way that Black study is being done, and Black political education and cultural engagement, and the survival of ideas, right, is really essential there. I mean, I know I've said it to both of you a bunch of times, but it was just that moment where I was sort of looked up and I was like, wait a minute, our entire existence as Black studies is due to students. And where are our students on this podcast? Because they're the ones who, they're the ones who are also targeted, but also do Black studies in that different register and different part of a campus, but part of that collective project. Not to mention all the numerous ways we have to keep thinking about it off campuses. So we all live off campuses too. There are our neighbors and our stores and all of that.
Yeah.
So.
Would either of you say that the function or mission of the podcast has like expanded since its first recording?
So I guess for me, I didn't go into this with a expectation or an idea of what it was like, who was going to say yes and how many episodes we would get to, and interest actually being in it, right? Like I was just like, okay, we're going to do a podcast. We'll see what happens. And I think that because of the response and because of the people who have so generously came on and talked and shared their knowledge, it, to me, and other people have said this to me in a way that's like super amazing and humbling, but like it's creating a record of like how people are thinking about Black studies at a particular time. And I don't know that I imagined or I had conceptualized that aspect of what it could be when we started. So that is it's really cool, but I don't know that I went into it like that wasn't the plan for me going into it to create a record. It was like, let's have some really great conversations to reflect on 50 plus years of our field. And then so much has happened since then that I feel like it has shifted in that way.
Yeah, I absolutely agree totally. And you and I have talked about this. Actually, it just sort of snuck up on us, that moment. I mean, I thought I had sort of two thoughts about what it could be. I thought it would just be really interesting and fun.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought people who work in the field, it'd be fun to like listen to, what Charles McKinney has to say, what Ruth Nicole Brown has to say. I mean, I just thought it'd be fun and interesting. And then I did think like it's important to honor the field. The 50th anniversary of departments came during the pandemic, and we didn't get to do that. And I thought maybe we'll like contribute to kind of honoring the field. And then there just was that moment in the late fall. And I remember talking with you about it. Actually, it was like, oh shit, we have something that is unprecedented and doesn't have a parallel. And we're pretty deep in it. So it's like either we just cut this off and say, well, we've done something fun, or we realize that we're documenting at 50 years, especially in this moment in 2025, what is Black studies been and becoming?
Mm-hmm.
In its moment of survival, because it's definitely going to have to try to survive, moment of its ending. I really hope that doesn't happen. But one way or another, it's like, once you get to, the 100th episode too also rings for me right there. It's like, oh, now this is the kind of thing that we should probably figure out where we're going to archive the audio files.
Yeah.
It's like we've gone beyond to sort of 30 of our friends, Yeah. But yeah, that shift in significance is so real. It's really exciting. It's humbling. And it's also kind of funny because it's like all we had to do was just like get somebody online and ask them to talk.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say it is still wild to me when I'll send out an invitation, particularly like send out an invitation to somebody I don't personally know, to somebody who I've been reading their work for years, and I think that they are amazing and brilliant. And they'll be like, yeah, I've been listening. And it's like, what? You
Yeah, there's some people when they say I've been listening, I was like, if I knew you were listening, I would have tried harder.
Yes, right? Like, oh no. Which episode did you listen to? Because I don't think I did that well, that one.
Let me go re-edit that and then listen again.
Yeah, it's wild, but it's amazing. And I'm so thankful.
Yeah, I've had a couple of people who, both of us, we read and really love and admire their work, and they're like, oh, I was wondering when my turn was going to be. I'm like, really? Okay. I'm always like, I'm like, me? Right? How could it be me?
Listen, early on, John, I don't know if you remember, I was like making a list. I was like, these are all the people I have to ask, because if I don't ask them, like, then my degree is useless. Like, these are all the people that I know I have to at least ask, and they're never going to say yes, but we have to ask just because, and then like send the email and they'll be like, yeah, whoa, I didn't even expect you to respond. Much less, come on. I was asking because I knew that you were so integral to the field that, like, I have to at least invite you, not actually anticipating that you would be willing to come and talk. It has been so, like, just, yeah, again, amazing and mind-blowing, and I'm so thankful.
Wow. It really sounds like the podcast has blossomed in like unimaginable ways for you both and everybody else, and that's something really to cherish.
I'm kind of glad it did blossom because, you know, if we had this high aspiration, I don't know, it just would have felt kind of like we were like putting on some sort of like thing. I kind of like that it just seemed like kind of fun and celebratory and interesting, and who knows. And then, yeah, all of a sudden, like a Kalimot or Normant, you know, real founders of the field, they're like, yes, let me be on and give serious conversation. It's wild.
Yes. This is going to be a really beautiful archive, and it is already one, but as it continues to grow, it's unimaginable how beautiful and expansive it'll become. So I want to transition just a little bit because I am curious to know, have any of the conversations you've both had across episodes shifted any of your pedagogical practices? And also, how has the podcast impacted your own research or how you think about what you do individually and then also in respect to the field itself?
I would say in terms of teaching, in terms of pedagogy, it had a huge impact that's really showing up this semester. I'm teaching a class on Spike Lee, and I've taught the class a bunch of times, and it's a fun class for me to teach, and I had a whole set of vocabulary for it. But to go back to what I was saying before about what crystallized for me in the podcast that Ashley did with Vince Brown was this, you know, that idea that there's a problem and sort of what gathers to solve that problem or to address that problem. That's been entirely the way I phrased the Spike Lee course. Before I was like, well, he has this sort of political question and he's sort of trying to do this form of representation. But instead, I just posed it as a Black Studies question in a way that, and I feel a little embarrassed by this, but I just had never explicitly made the course a Black Studies question. And so, you know, if any students are listening to this, they'll like roll their eyes, but I keep saying Spike Lee has a problem. How do you put Black bodies, Black people, and Black life on a screen? Mm-hmm. Right? What kind of language do you use? What kind of lighting do you use? What kind of scripts do you write? What kind of actors do you put on? You know, and so, but unfolding it from that's his problem. And we'll stage that. We stage it with Robert Townsend's Hollywood Shuffle and his 2000 film, Lee's 2000 film Bamboozled, right? That representation is a crisis. And then it's like, well, now I posed it as a problem. And like, let's not just say, oh, he's trying to make a film about this problem or solve the problem in a film, but it's like that film is a whole collection of methodologies, and just reframing it like that. I don't know what the students think. They seem to like it. We'll see on the evaluations. But for me, the class what I was trying to do became so much clearer, right? So I would say in terms of pedagogy, it's really had that impact. And I hadn't anticipated that. I'm like so happy about it. But I didn't see that coming because I never thought like, I can't figure out how to present my class. I never thought that. I was like, this is a Black Studies class. And then it was that moment where I was like, a few of these podcasts give me a vocabulary for explaining to students how it's a Black Studies class and to myself.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely shifted how I think about the classroom. That's something that I went into Black Studies because of a teacher, right? Like, because Austin Jackson was my first year writing instructor, and the way that he structured that course, the readings he chose, and then to know after, like, that was the first time that I knew that this is a thing that like you could do for like ever. Like, I didn't know that I could just go and explore these questions and talk about Black people and research with and for and through Blackness. I didn't know that was a thing until then. So the pedagogy piece has always been something that is super integral and central to how I approach the academy in general. But having these conversations and listening to so many amazing, first of all, just like literal practices. Like, what are the strategies you're using to get students to engage? How does this classroom look different than it would if it was in history or if it was in English? Like, what are the things that Black studies classrooms are literally doing? But also, how do we approach the dissemination and the collaborative creation of knowledge? So I've restructured my courses and I've thought about, like I'm teaching a Black culture class now, Black culture in the US, and I completely changed the order of the information, right? Like, so traditionally this course goes more chronological. Yeah, scrap that. We're going to start with talking about Black ways of knowing, because everything else that we're going to look into, you've got to have the framework of Black ways of knowing to actually understand it. And whereas before I had like 1 or 2 intro weeks, we're just now actually talking about like enslavement halfway through the semester, because everything leading up until this point was, no, let's think about what it means to have this type of knowledge, right? Let's think about the different ways that knowledge is generated, disseminated, and shared among Black people before we go and look at these moments or situations or circumstances over time that involve them. And I think that that has been really helpful. And then I have another course that's a capstone course for the anti-Black racism minor. And with that, it is the goal, or one of the goals of that course, is for your capstone project to actually have solutions embedded. And so I think that the conversations that we've been able to have with people have really helped me to expand the toolkit that I can share with students for methods, for thinking about these problems and issues that negatively impact Black people in their fields and disciplines. Because that's the goal. Take a problem related to anti-Blackness in your discipline or in your future career, and let's talk about how we can address that. But doing so explicitly through the lens of Black ways of knowing, like directly saying that, is something that, John, like you said, it's not like I didn't say that explicitly before. And I might have thought about it, right? And I might have tried to guide students to that and making sure that they account for the inherent biases that are in many of the traditional disciplinary methods, but I didn't say it. And I think saying it is so important, and making sure that students also have that framework and, I don't want to say permission, but like giving them, translating that language like from the amazing people on the podcast to students so that they also have the language, has been very impactful in my teaching.
And I think that the political significance of saying Black ways of knowing are the centerpiece and foundation of everything we're doing in this class. And it being a class that takes on like big transformative issues, the political impact on that of that on students, I think, is enormous, in the sense that it just tells them you don't need an external way of knowing to make sense of this. You don't need to translate it. You don't need to modify it. And I didn't mention this, but listening to you talk, I remembered that I had meant to. That the exact phrase in my James Baldwin seminar, I keep coming back to. It's like, let's watch for these moments where Baldwin is making this reference, very subtle, to Black ways of knowing, where his text, although it's addressed to all Americans, because he's very much about an address to all Americans. But these moments where the text folds itself back into a Black ways of knowing, when he's talking about like funeral, there's this, my students, if they listen to this, they keep hearing about this. I think they're getting tired of this example, but where he talks about his father's funeral, and he just talks about walking around this corner in his grief and seeing these older women who had gathered, and he said they always seem to come out of nowhere, but they know how to cook, they know how to care for the children, they know how to make it possible for people to mourn. And when I talked about that, I said, what do you hear in that? And some students were like, non-Black students were like, it sounds like this sort of a community. And then there were Black students who were like, yeah, I know. Who are those women? They're everywhere, right? They always are there. And sort of, then we talked about gender and stuff, but it was that Black way of knowing that he's sort of pointing to this ritual, this knowledge, this community structure. And I just didn't have the phrasing for it, or really the eye for it, until this podcast. Basically saying exactly what you said, but applying it to this particular moment in my class. So, yeah. And I love that. I had never expected that from the podcast, I will say. I did not see that coming.
Wow. Thank you both. It's really enriching to just listen to your experiences and how through these various conversations you've had across time with different scholars in the field. And even in reflection on your own, work, how so much has changed and just evolved in really insightful and fruitful ways. So thank you so much for sharing. My last question that I do want to ask is about the podcast itself. More specifically, what do you want for the future of the podcast? And do you see the podcast expanding into different projects or new forms in the upcoming future?
I mean, in terms of the podcast itself, I just want to continue to be able to have conversations with people who do Black studies in the academy, out of the academy, artists and activists and librarians and regular, everyday people who are just living their lives, but are the walking embodiment of Black studies. I want to be able to continue to have these conversations and to have a space where anybody can come and learn more about Black studies and the limitless opportunity that there is in Black studies. I think it's really helpful to think about all the ways that people conceptualize and utilize Black studies across careers and fields and disciplines and regions and contexts. It is applicable to any situation, right? And I think that it's helpful to have a place where that is clear. You can just choose a random episode and learn something from it that you can utilize in your own life, be that professional or personal. And I love that. And I just want to keep doing that and add more voices and more perspectives to the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, saying many, I would say, basically the same thing. I mean, at the expansiveness, I think of it as a challenge for myself, but also for the three of us in conversation in the coming months and hopefully years of just how to be expansive, right? How to keep that imagination of how to broaden. And I have a notebook where I write down just things that occur to me. So just give an example. Yesterday, I already referenced this before, but yesterday was doing a podcast with Kelly Morgan, who's a curator and runs the Black Artists Archive in Detroit. But she was talking about when she was a curator at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, and she was trying to solve this puzzle, or I think she was asked to solve this puzzle, how can we get more Black people in the museum, right? And so it was always for everybody, for the previous curators or managers, it was get more Black art in there. But she said, no, let's open up our space and let church groups, sororities and fraternities come host their social events here.
Mm.
Even if they get together to do a Bible study or planning, a holiday event or, whatever a sorority or fraternity would do in terms of, of its professional organization, just get them in the space and see what happens. And so, I love that. And I was in my head, I was I hope other curators hear this. This seems like a amazing idea. But then I also started to think in what ways would it be possible to talk to the people who did that? To talk to the people, it's what was it like to enter this space?
Mm-hmm.
How did it impact the way, I wouldn't put it this way, but that you do Black study, right? That you think about Black life and community and organization and political work or cultural or social work. And just thinking not only about how, that expansive, not only in terms of what are the different stages in which Black study is done, but also what about the people who are inside that Black study? Busboys and Poets in Hyattsville, it's 5 minutes from my house. Catch the poets after one of these spoken word events and talk to them about, as well as the organizer of the event, right?
Mm-hmm.
About what's it like to stage it, but also what's it like to be inside it. So just to your point of expansive, trying to keep my imagination alive for that, because I love the origins of the field. We got to get as many of the originators of the field as we can on it. Students, campus leaders, young, middle, whatever professors, but also all these artists, activists, and the people who live inside the spaces that they create. I think trying to find ways to do that is one of my hopes. I don't know how to do it, but I'm keeping it in my conscience as a thing. We need to do this. We need to find a way to do this over the years.
Wow. Thank you both. I'm very honored to be a part of the podcast as it is continuing to grow and blossom in these unimaginable ways.
Brielle, we haven't actually introduced you formally, right? So you're joining the podcast, but you have not
Yes.
said much about yourself.
I can give a brief kind of introduction to the listeners. So, hi everyone. My name is Gorrell. I go by Brie. I'm currently a PhD student here at the University of Maryland in their English department. My research interests are varied, but I can say that I am very interested in Black feminist cultural productions and the ongoing discourses in Black studies as they are related to Black life, culture, art. I am also a poet, and as I've said before, I am extremely honored to be able to share space with Dr. Drabinski and Dr. Newby, and also to just be a part of this amazing project.
Yeah, I mean,
have
that's
nothing else
where
to say.
you and the your connection to other poets. I mean, I remember we had a conversation just a couple weeks ago, and you were like, "Was this artist who I ran into is interesting? Is that somebody?" And I was like, "It's everybody."
Yes.
And those
Yes, I'm
poetry
excited to
circles.
be bringing on the artists who I commune with and share space and create with, and also just interviewing scholars and whomever else I come across that is interested in talking about their attentiveness to Black life and their care for Black study and Black studies.
And you were a listener too before this, so
Yes. So extremely excited to now be a voice that people can listen to while I continue to listen.
well, I'm super happy that you're part of the project. So I think it's going to really add a really important dimension. So thank you.
I agree. I'm very excited about your episodes and all of the amazing interviews you will also be able to conduct. So I'm glad you're here.
Thank you both so much. Well, it has been great speaking with you both, and I hope you both have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Thank you.